Thank you all for joining us today in this CALS Comm workshop. People are probably going to continue to come in as we talk, but I want to get started. So initially, today we're talking about media relations, especially related to researchers and some of their best case scenarios, worst case scenarios, how to make the most of pushing your research out to the public. And we're going to just jump right in and get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce everyone, and starting with Andrew Binder. Andrew Binder is an associate professor of in the Department of Communications and co-director of the Community Engagement Core at the Center for Health and Human Health and Environment at North Carolina State University. He conducts research on controversial science topics, including how information about those topics is transmitted through various communications channels and what impact that communication has on risk perception and public understanding of science. Thanks for joining us today, Andy. Next up, we have Ben Chapman. Ben Chapman is interim department head in the Department of Agriculture and Human Sciences, professor and director of Food Safety Extension and Research Program at NC State. With the goal of reducing foodborne illness, his group researches food handling and food safety systems, designs and implements food safety strategies, and evaluates messages and media from farm to fork. Since February 2020, Ben has been providing guidance to the food sector on issues related to food safety and COVID-19. Ben is the co-chair of STOP. Is it STOP or is it STOP?
Stop. Yeah.
Foodborne Illness Board of Directors, an advocacy group for individuals affected by foodborne pathogens. Ben also co-hosts 2 podcasts, Food Safety Talk and Risky or Not, as well as participates in social media. Find him at Ben Chapman on Twitter. Next up, Rob Dunn. Rob, this is an old bio, but we'll curve with it.
I'm an old guy.
As a professor in the Department of Applied Ecology at NC State, his research focuses on the ecology and evolution of daily life of societies, be they those of humans or ants. This work includes work on face mites, belly button bacteria, beetles that ride on ants as they move from place to place, and house cats. His work often engages the public either directly in participatory science or through telling stories about the process of science. It is in telling those stories that Dr. Dunn writes for publications like the National Geographic and Scientific America. He's also coordinating the writing of many books, because I don't think that's the right number anymore, and the University of Chicago Press, written on a basis of data collected by citizen scientists on ants, spiders, arthropods of homes, and microscopic life in homes. Thanks for joining us, Rob.
My pleasure.
Next up, Lindsay Hayes Maslow is an associate professor and extension specialist in the Department of Agriculture and Human Sciences. She's an expert on the intersection between food systems, nutrition, and public health, as well as the impact of government policies driving the food system. Before coming to NC State, Lindsay worked for the advocacy organization, the Union of Concerned Scientists, on federal food and nutrition policies. She has a PhD in health policy and management and a master's in health administration from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Thanks for joining us, Lindsay. And last up, with our P last name, Jennifer Pancorba is a director of industry programs and research at BTech over on Centennial Campus, where she continuously builds the center's relationship with the pharmaceutical and biotechnology industries through the program she leads: Bioprocess Services, Bioprocess Research, and Professional Development Program. Dr. Pancorba is responsible for courses in pharmaceutical production and supports professional development courses in both upstream and downstream processes. In addition, she functions as project coordinator for BTech in International Influenza Vaccine Manufacturing Program. She has over 15 years of experience in biomanufacturing, 5 of those focused in the vaccine field, particularly in developing downstream purification processes and optimizing upstream production strategies for vector vaccines. Dr. Piancorba has a Bachelor of Science degree in chemical engineering and a doctorate in chemical and biochemical engineering, where she focuses on the design and development of targeted drug delivery. Thank you, Jennifer, for joining us today. So glad to have everyone here. And before we jump into the questions, which I'm going to use a lot of what you all have submitted previously, but also you're welcome to submit questions as we go through the Q&A. You can upvote questions if you're interested in hearing something that somebody's already submitted, and or drop it in the chat if that's more comfortable. So our first step is going to be talking through what was your best or worst case media relation to date. And we're going to start with Jennifer.
I thought I was last.
Not anymore. We're doing a...
All right. Okay. I'll get started by explaining that my coming to the public communication sector came last year because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and because my expertise in vaccine manufacturing put me in the spot of a lot of people who wanted to understand more about how vaccines are made, why it takes so long for our COVID vaccine to get out, why it's being reviewed the way it's being reviewed. And so I was starting to get involved in a lot of communications with that. I've been doing a number of those ever since, that include television, from our local WRAL to CNN, also written press, Scientific America, the Wall Street Journal, and our local, papers as well. I've done blogs with the university and outside. But the most interesting experience for me has actually been radio. Radio gives you a really nice platform to reach out people really closely. And to me, it was a lot of fun. I did one particular one with New York City's Pacifica Radio, and was a noon show on a Saturday. It's called She's on Call. And it was all about answering questions from people about the pandemic and vaccines and how they're made. I found it quite interesting, quite exciting. It was live, but live in the sense of radio, not live in the sense of CNN through satellite type thing. You don't see anybody, you have a screen blank. Radio, you hear human beings on the other side concerned about their vaccines, about why they need to be vaccinated or not. If they opt to do that, what does that mean? What options they may have, how to find more information. So to me, having that approach to people and being able to shed some light on those concerns felt really changing, really formative and transformative. And I really, truly love that experience.
That's so cool. We do, radio is still very present, and especially like what you said with podcasts, it still stays very relevant and can reach a lot of people. Okay.
It was quite fun.
On to you, Lindsay. What was your best or worst?
Yeah, I'll start with my best. So when I was in DC, I worked with a professional political advocacy media training individual that works with female candidates running for office. And she was teaching me how to do TV interviews. And I did not realize how complicated those were until we actually did a trial run. I had a research study coming out, and essentially she was testing me on trying to get me to answer questions in a way that probably would have taken me away from the main point of my research. So a lot of that was her filming me, asking me the questions, and then showing me where I fell into the trap and how I can redirect back to my main point. And small things like, how do you sit? I mean, you sit at the edge of your chair. What colors do you wear? How do you look at the camera? How do you make sure you're not doing, and I joke because we do this all the time in Zoom, but we're nodding, saying we understand, but when you're watching on TV, they call that the bobblehead, and it actually really annoys viewers when you do this the entire time. So when I do TV, I do try to remain cognizant of how I'm speaking, how I'm talking, and also, when we can get into this later, how you make sure you don't fall into the trap of those tricky questions where all of a sudden you can realize you are no longer talking about what you want to talk about. So how do you bring it back to your message, and how do you control your message?
Okay, so it sounded like that that you were hinting that there might be a worse. And I guess I know that for some faculty members, there's been cases in the past where there were situations where people felt duped, and we're kind of, I hope, like to think that we're moving away from that. But you know, it does, the bad always makes for a good story. So if you have a bad too, you're welcome to share it. If not, it's all good too. Okay, Rob, you're up.
Thank you. I was trying to think about what makes the most sense to tell here. I mean, I've had lots of bad ones, almost all on me. In most cases, it's, you know, if something goes wrong, it's your fault as the interviewee. And in most cases, it's because of a mismatch between your expectations of what the interviewer knows or is going to do and your expectations about the audience. And I was trying to think of a really good example of this. And I have one that's sort of a chronic example rather than a specific moment, in that we worked a lot on skin bacteria for a while. And we did lots of public relations around that because a lot of the work was about engaging people to think about skin bacteria and microbiomes in new, better ways. And what we would see is again and again that if we weren't careful to frame those conversations as we were having them relative to our goals, that the easiest story to write about that material was a story that was mostly negative, which I view as our fault, in that it was then our job to anticipate that if we give you this content, the easiest thing you can do about it is to scare people. Because the writers, the radio people, you know, they've got a busy job, and your job in a way when you're being interviewed is to make it easier for them to write the kind of story that you would like them to write. And the flip side to that story of our sort of the years of accidentally spreading the wrong message about body microbes because we weren't managing that, is that at one point we worked with an artist who engaged people in talking to their body microbes. And so she would go into Times Square and ask people that what would you say to your belly button microbes? And that single act transformed how those people talked about those microbes. And it also changed every piece of reporting that followed from that work. And so I'll come back to this, but I think there's a lot of work to do in thinking about, you know, how would you make it easier for somebody to understand this story in the context you want it understood in? And what's the easiest thing for a journalist to see and write about? And how do you structure that? And it's taken me a long time to realize and negotiate that. And I guess the other failures I have lots of are failing to explain something that's obvious to me and not obvious to the writer, to the reader. And we can come back to that.
I would love to see video of people talking to their belly button microbes to see how that kind of looks in real time.
If there's a quiet period, I'll see if I can grab one and share it.
Okay, on to you, Ben.
So I guess the situation for me, similar to Rob, there's lots of times where I've spoken and maybe under-explained something or made some assumptions about what I was talking about that the interviewee or the audience that they were going to share the information with just didn't have the contextual foundation. And I agree with Rob 100%. A lot of the time that's on me for not thinking about it or really starting at understanding expectations. But the one I'll give you was kind of a good and a bad. My group published a paper 5 or 6 years ago looking at recipes in cookbooks from the New York Times bestseller list, and really sort of looking at where we thought people were getting information. And one thing that was kind of lost on us in doing the research that became much more apparent in the media that resulted was that if you look at recipe books, cookbooks on the New York Times bestseller, largely they're from celebrities or celebrity chefs. And once you engage in a science discussion that has a twist of celebrity, it's a whole different type of audience. And so what ended up happening was the US media really didn't care at all about our study, but the British tabloids did, because Gwyneth Paltrow had 2 books on the New York Times bestseller list. And so I got multiple calls from like the Sun and the Telegraph, just British tabloids, about how bad Gwyneth Paltrow's food safety habits were. And in fact, those were the questions, not about like what was in the book. It was, well, would you go eat dinner at Gwyneth Paltrow's house? And so trying to steer that back to, well, here's what the research was, and here are some recipes, and here are some examples of things that would not be science-based that are in these recipes, literally spun into Gwyneth Paltrow's public relations team fighting back through the tabloids with me. And then it got even more like meta, where a journalist who I knew at the Charlotte Observer wanted to write an article about the fight, not the research. And so it was a really, for me, it was a lesson on framing discussion. And I was really, in some of my earlier interviews around this, I was really like kind of offhanded comments, because I thought it was really just about the recipes, but the way that it kind of spun was more about celebrity versus scientist.
Yeah, that paints a very colorful picture of your research being featured in British tabloids.
Yeah, it was weird.
Andy?
Yeah, I would say I have had one, I think, really great experience, and that was being interviewed by Frank Stasio on The State of Things on WUNC. And that's, I don't know, all great experiences are all similar and bad experiences are all different in their own way, to paraphrase a Russian novelist. I think that the time I had a bad experience was sort of on the local Spectrum TV, when it was still Time Warner TV, like cable news channel. And one of the graduate students from our master's program was working at that station. And there was this announcement from Electronic Arts, EA Sports, that produces video games about stuff. And she remembered that I had said in a class introduction that I play video games. And so she was like, oh, we should get Dr. Binder on the line to talk about this thing. And she contacted me and I was like, well, I don't really, that's not an object of my research. It's just something that I do. And so you should talk to this faculty member, who wasn't available. So I acquiesced and I was like, sure, I can do this. And mostly it was just feeling out of my depth or out of my element in terms of what I could and couldn't say, and basically had to approach it in terms of, this is my own experience and this is maybe what some of the research says about this stuff. But I was in a unique position because I could talk about it from the perspective of somebody who participates in this activity and also is familiar with some of the communication research on this activity, but I couldn't speak to it in terms of my specific expertise. Sometimes that's beneficial because, as we've heard from some other panelists already, like the journalists are looking to tell a story, and part of telling a story is either having conflict, which is what Ben was just talking about, or just having sort of an inroads to talking about a personal experience. And you sort of need a person in order to talk about personal experience. And that's one of the drawbacks of talking about scientific research often, is that it's not easy to talk about a specific person's experience, because that's viewed as anecdotal evidence. But sometimes in these media interviews, it can be beneficial to sort of embrace that idea and lean into how your own personal experience sort of informs your perspective on that idea.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to jump right into questions. If any questions come up from audience members, again, please drop them into the Q&A. And Lindsay, I'm going to start with you because you have had a busy couple of months, and specifically related to kind of, the question is like, do you see what's kind of trending and you try to make connections with your research like that? Or is it that you have a publication coming out and then you say, what would be the best partners to share this information more widely? Kind of like run through how you approach situations like that.
Yeah, I think that's a both. And normally I try to capitalize on what is in the mainstream media right now. And if my study or my research doesn't directly connect to it, is there a way I can find a hook? Can I get people to start paying attention to something else? We recently had a study that looked at the relationship between mental health and physical activity during COVID-19. And I immediately reached out to NC State's communications team and said, do we want to do a press release? Let's see if this gets picked up. My expectations were that actually news outlets would be tired of reporting on anything COVID-19 related, but I just threw it out there. But fortunately, we had a lot of interest, a lot of radio interest, newspapers wanting to write about it. So I definitely think it is, what is your research and what outcome do you want to see? I think that's the biggest thing, because for me, I just can't write and publish a research study and let it sit there. That's not rewarding to me. To me is getting it out to the public. And I know the public's not even going to read that 10 to 20 page research study. So I think the best way to do that is looking at different media outlets and then again, trying to convey that information. So again, it's whether or not you want to try to capitalize on what's happening in the moment, or how can you connect your research and make it more relevant to the moment.
And I guess I'll ask that same question, Ben and Jennifer, because I know, especially related to COVID-19, you've both had a lot of press over the past year and a half. Is that similar, or is it sometimes that you see what's really important right now, and then you make decisions to kind of figure out how to best inform the public?
I can start with this. I actually see it as two separate things, but the experience around working with media helps both of the situations. So for me, for instance, most of my calls come from a policy change, an outbreak, a recall, some event that's happening in the world of food safety. And since I'm out there doing a lot of communication in this world, it's often, hey, so today, exactly, like I'll give you a perfect example. Last night there was a FDA released some information about a salmonella outbreak that's really, really sizable for us in the world of food safety, 500 plus people linked to onions. And so I've had 3 or 4 calls this morning of, so, tell us about how likely it is to have salmonella in onions. Should I throw all my onions out? What about foods that have cooked onions? Same questions all the time. And I want to respond to those. But I don't have any research on onions, right? Like I'm not an onion food safety specialist. I do have a history of doing research in consumer food handling. So what I do is spend a lot of time talking about, here's one situation, how we think these onions got contaminated. And here's how my research kind of slides in to support what people may or may not be doing in their home, or how they handle recalls, or how they get information. It kind of depends on the situation. I find it really cyclical. Like I want to, if I have a paper that's published, because you don't often control that time frame, I might want to look for a tie-in when I'm working with news services or CALS communications about a press release. But this onion salmonella outbreak doesn't connect specifically to a paper that I have. So it's kind of this game of back and forth. And I would say that, the question about how that's changed over the trajectory of my career, the more you're in the media, the more the media calls. So the sought after part over the 13 years I've been at NC State has gone drastically up, because those old, I don't know, interviews exist out there. If you look for like salmonella expert onions, maybe my name pops up because there's been a lot of media in the past. And so I think it grows. But I think those two, I think the two things are separate. I think when we're seeking to promote, like Lindsay said, what our research and take it to people, that it's sometimes a different mindset than, all right, what's the flavor of food safety today?
Yeah, if I may add, my experience is more in the lines of what Ben described as the onion case, rather than the promotion that Lindsay described. Because it was COVID-19 and I manufacture vaccines and I've been involved with viral vector vaccines in particular, then I just got a lot of questions. And just like Ben described, the more questions you answer, the more you come into the spotlight that you have answers to those questions. And so the more people start approaching you. So you answer a question for WRAL, and then someone from, ProPublica will come and reach out to you, and someone from here or there or everywhere. So that was kind of the experience I've been having with all of these. And sometimes it's been a simple thing as a chain of colleagues within NC State discussing a new paper about COVID-19 vaccines that was published. And then that we decide, well, this is really relevant information that should be presented to the public. So we reach out to university communications, and from that email exchange, then they create a piece that they put out there that helps people understand better what vaccines are relevant, what technology is behind. And then, interestingly enough, I'm happy to say people do read those pieces that are put out there. And then I get reached out by the public saying, oh, I read this question answer paper that was presented by NC State, and I was wondering if you could answer to me. I'm trying to inform myself. I have a parent or a family member that has this situation. I'm concerned about vaccines. Where can I find information? Now, so in my particular case, it's not so much me trying to get out there and promote research I do with vaccines. It's more the spur of the moment, the concern that is happening about COVID-19, and people reaching out from the public and the media.
Rob?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think there's a career stage part of this too, that, and Andy mentioned this in a document we looked at together, which is that I think early in your career, when you as an individual are writing many of your papers as the first author, that very often there's the advocating those papers and getting them into the news and then talking about those papers benefits your career and benefits the ability of people to understand what you're doing. And as your career goes on, I think there's more and more benefit to taking the role of helping readers, helping writers think about bigger picture things. And so I'm now at the stage where I'm much more likely to help a graduate student or a postdoc advocate their own paper with them as the person that's talking. And I'm more likely to get the calls about a bigger picture thing. And which is also better suited to me at this stage because, often I forget even the details of a particular paper. And so I'm not even the best person to talk about it. And that just changes through time. And I guess we'll come back to it, but the benefits to the researcher of doing all of this also change a lot through time. And so what do you want to get out of that? I think that's, when you're starting to practice doing a few of these, that doesn't matter so much. You do need to practice. But then as you start to control them more, like what is your actual goal with this engagement? And which of these things you do really depends on what that goal is going to be.
That plays really well into what I was going to ask next, like knowing what you know now, and Rob, we'll start with you, knowing what you know now. If you were early in your career and you had a new journal article published, how would you go about trying to get more attention to that piece?
So I mean, I think So you can work with the communications team at your university, at NC State in this case. Typically there's a college team and a university team, and you can work with both. Sometimes there's a department team. And so so you can draft a press release. You can also write your own release that you share with people, so you can share it with your scientific community and get it out a little bit that way. And then the other thing is, just as an example, a few years ago, there was a insect apocalypse piece in the New York Times by Brooke Burrell, really good piece. And so then Brooke becomes a great person for a graduate student to just email and say, hey, look, this builds on what you already wrote about, but turns it in a new direction. And because she already knows the material, she's a great person to respond to that. And journalists like getting cool papers. I mean, I think that there's a worry that they're probably very busy, but if they have your contact and it's something exciting, they're typically receptive. And like any humans, most of them are nice, and not all of them, but that's just the reality.
Andy, can you add to that?
I don't know. I think what Rob said is very well said.
Well, and so that kind of moves into, if you are planning to talk with someone, and I think, Lindsay alluded to it a little earlier, like how can you try to stay on message? Like, what can you do to stay, focused on what you came to the conversation to talk about?
So I would, the way that I talk about this with undergraduate students, so I teach now, there's a minor in science communication for undergraduate students. And the way we develop the course is to, obviously there's an element of crafting your message. It's been mentioned already that you need to know your audience. And so anticipating what the audience is going to be. But I think an overlooked aspect that people don't really think about is knowing yourself, like knowing your role in the situation that you're going into. And you sort of have to be deliberate about choosing what role you want to play, right? Like, do you want to be in the role of a pure scientist? That can be a good choice, right? If you want to talk about purely just about the research that you've done and what it means in the scientific literature. But a lot of times media interviews are going to want you to go a step further, right? Like, what does it mean for people's lives in terms of what they can do and stuff like that. And so then you have to think about, well, do I want to be an advocate, right? Do I want to basically lay out the sort of survey the land in terms of what people's options are and say, this is the thing that you should do, right? Which could be a case of getting a vaccine, right? Could be something like that. Like, you sort of lay out all the possibilities and you zero in on, okay, you should get this vaccine. So that would be the advocacy role. And then another one that's popular is being an honest broker. So that's a little bit more complicated, but it's sort of like you lay out all the different options and you say, okay, if you want to do this, then you should do that. If you want to do this other thing, then you should do that other thing, right? And sort of leave it up to the people to decide. And so once you sort of decide on that role you want to play, it's much easier to craft the message that you want and then sort of stay on message. The only other thing I would say, and I'd be interested in hearing what Lindsay got in her training, is that as academics, it's really hard for us to give short answers. And that's going to be a real plus in terms of media interviews. And so practicing giving a short answer, especially if it's a question that you're not expecting or that you're surprised by, like, you do the yes and kind of improv approach, like, yes, I acknowledge that you asked me this question, and now I'm going to give you the answer in terms of the role that I've chosen to play. So that would be my response in terms of developing and going into preparing for a media interview.
Yeah, and I'll just even kind of answer Andrew's question. And I'm a visual learner, so my messaging techniques are to follow. This is what I call the window. I don't know if you can see it. So essentially, here's your main message. So you have 4 different subcategories. So whatever question you get, you're always going to go to 4 of those different answers, and you will always redirect to that main point. So it's a, yes, I acknowledge the question. Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up. That actually is a really nice segue into what my study focuses on, or this is what I want to talk about. And so that's where I think we don't always get that training of, we get thrown off by a question because we get into our science brain of, I don't have the evidence. I didn't do that research. Like Ben mentioned, onions and salmonella. I mean, did he do a research study on it? But he can probably comment on it. So I think that, helping our brains operate in this window is almost like our life raft of, I can control the question and how I respond to it. And then again, just always redirecting to what you want to focus on and what you want to say. And you will get nudged. There are, I think, some reporters and some media folks that want to see, I think, an interesting interview or something that might, bring up even more questions or more interviews later on. And again, if you're worried about that, again, this is like your safety net. It's your life raft. It's a way for you to stay on point.
If I may add, to me, it was extremely important to maintain my words down to earth, if I may say it that way, specifically because I'm trying to reframe the engineering me. Remember, I was not talking to a panel of engineers. I was talking to my grandma who barely finished high school, and she needed to understand the nuances of vaccine manufacturing as clearly as down to earth as possible. So to me, that was critical, that whenever I spoke to anybody about this, reaching all these big audiences, I was clear and concise and trying to find words that were really general and to make the message more clear to any other Jane instead of a colleague in the engineering field. And that I think helped me a lot.
I'll add a couple of things here. From a technical writing standpoint, I think what made me a better technical writer was reading a lot of technical papers that were good. And similarly, I think from a media standpoint, I'm a drastic consumer of media. I mean, I read news stories related to food safety. I watch everything. So I get a sense just from that iteration of how it's portrayed out there, what makes for good, and to Andy's point, what my role is in this. And I think I've been sort of all of those different roles depending on the situation, but being able to have a sense from just like every day reading news around science on who, and being able to pick out what's the role, was this a good quote, was that translated well enough. And it's not like it takes a lot of time, but it's something that I do because I'm interested in it all the time. And I think it's made me a much better like interviewee. And I do, to Andy's point, I do, and Lindsay's point as well, I do a lot of yes ands. I mean, it is the, let me answer that question, but here, let me come back to the thing that maybe you're not thinking about. And really good journalists always end their interviews with, what else have I not asked you about? What else do you want to say? And I take that opportunity to give them those yes ands again. I know I've already said this, but let me just re-hit this point, one or two more times. It is a game, right? Like there's a goal, the role is important, but consuming it helps me figure out where I am in that game.
I was just going to add 2 quick things. I mean, oh, sorry, go on, Janine.
No, I was just going to say, and from the reporter side, usually during that last time where the interviewee is giving you their points, that's where you have the best quotes. That's where like the kind of most interesting part of the interview comes up, not even when there are questions, just when it's kind of more natural and flowing. To you, Rob?
Yeah, well, so I was going to say that it depends on the media a lot. So radio and print, super different. I mean, radio, part of your job is entertainment. And so you also need to be funny. You need to be engaging. Like people need to want to hear. If they turn off the radio, you lost. And and it's really easy to turn off the radio. And so if your big point is at the end and they turned off the radio before they got to you, that's great. They heard your name and where you're from, and then they realize they don't like you. But print is very different. And that if you're doing a print interview, it's almost always a 24-hour deadline for somebody by the time they get to you. And so that means they have to write 1,000 words or even 5,000 words, rarely 5,000 words, but they're going to have to do it quickly. And so the two things you're doing there, one is you're helping them craft the thesis and the structure of what they write. And so if you have a thesis that's interesting and that you can imagine as the piece, you can make their job easier. And there's something very satisfying in seeing somebody write a piece that's basically the content that you gave them redigested in their words. But then the other piece is they need quotes. And very often when scientists respond to journalists, they speak in huge, dense paragraphs. And you'll see this like in the New York Times, and you'll see a quote that says, "And so-and-so said, we really like to do this work." That means there was a 2-hour interview, and the only digestible piece of knowledge from all of that was, and we really like to do. And so I write down quotes in advance. After a written interview, I'll send an email like, "Hey, what I forgot to say, and you can quote this, is this." And they'll use it because they need, for a 1,000-word piece, they need 5 quotes. And so that's the place that your name turns up, that NC State turns up. And so it's worth keeping in mind that these formats are very different. TV is different, podcasts are different. But I'll stop there.
If I might have a minute, I wanted to raise a point that Ben made earlier about being informed. I think it's critical to stay up to the news. It's actually a hard job sometimes, but they are going to ask you about that. They're going to ask you about that article that was released this morning about this and that research and about this and this other situation that happened. So it is very important for your credibility and to bring your message forward that you are aware of those things that are happening around your field and then be able to comment on them.
And earlier a question had come up about press releases. Like, Andy, what's your kind of take on press releases now? What to do with them? Are they important? And that's, I'm looking at you as a communications faculty member, also as as a media relations specialist.
I mean, in my experience, I've just gone through my College of Humanities and Social Sciences communications person, Matt Shipman, in the Butler building. And I've been very successful with that. I mean, he sits down with you and you write a press release and then sends it out. And sometimes it gets picked up and sometimes it doesn't, but it still feels like a good exercise to do. I don't have a huge social media presence in a professional capacity. And so I don't have much experience with that, but that's another way, right? If you've cultivated sort of an audience through social media, then I would see that as another good way of getting the word out about your research and what you're up to.
You must have been sensing my brain waves, because that's where we're going next. We only have about 9 minutes left, but let's talk about social media, what you like, what you don't like, how it works for you, how it works, how to best make it work for you. Let's start with Ben.
Yeah, so I really like it. I think that for me, I don't use it, and I don't just use it as here's a vehicle for me to have one-way directional communication with anybody. I use it as an engagement platform. We do research on it, related to what types of messages work and what don't. So I think that oftentimes faculty or scientists look at social media as kind of this bear of, well, I don't know if I want to do it or not. And I've always tried to leverage the social media presence that I do have to get a lot of different things out of it. Sometimes it's a sounding board for something that I'm thinking about, and maybe I can get some feedback. Other times it's a way for me to promote something that's that we're doing within my program. Other times I'm just following a bunch of people that are adjacent to the food world where they've got questions and I'm answering questions and doing a variety of different things. So I see social media as part of my outreach and extension program as much as talking about my research. Like, it is an integral part, and it's something that we've built within the Safe Plates program. This is one of the questions that comes up all the time in situations like this. Janine, someone's like, well, how much time do you spend on social media? I don't know. I mean, like, how much time do you spend on email? it's as much as you want to put into it, and as much as you want to walk away. There's no magic, magic answer to that. And each community and topic area is different.
I guess in my case, social media is not different than any other media. So it's another TV, it's another radio, it's another print press. So it's another vehicle for me to reach people. We use it a lot to distribute information about our training programs, about our courses, about research we've done, about a collaboration we've initiated with a partner, to engage our collaborations between students and industry and faculty members and various organizations. It's really easy to create, to connect people through social media. So it really becomes an easy vehicle for that. Like any of the other media has advantages and disadvantages. So I try to find the things in which is great, like connecting people through it. And then I use other media for their strengths as well. But it's just another tool.
Rob, Lindsay, Andy, do you have anything to add?
I've used it a lot at various points. Right now, I don't use it at all. I mean, I don't personally like it, but I view it as a tool. And so sometimes it's a tool we use, but I mean, I spend basically zero time on social media. So, and I'm more pleased by that, but it's a tool for certain things for me that sometimes we dip back in and use more.
I would just add, I remember one of the pre-questions that you shared with us, Janine, was somebody asking about how do you get to feel more comfortable doing things? And I would that connects to me to social media. I just don't feel comfortable on it. And so it's better for my mental health not to be engaging on it, for me personally. And so it's important to sort of be a little reflexive about that and say, do I really want to do this, or is it going to cause me more trouble than it's worth? And, that goes back to what I talked about roles too. Like, if you are really into your research and you just really want to be that pure scientist, then maybe you're not the best spokesperson, right? And that's okay too. Like, it's not something that I think for some people, having more practice obviously makes you more comfortable, but it could be that in your situation, for your personality, it's just not something that makes you comfortable. I mean, doing media interviews or being on social media, the whole thing. And so, thinking about that and sort of being honest with yourself, I think, is an important thing to do too.
And I would just add that, and I do have a Twitter account, a professional Twitter account. I don't do any other social media professionally, but I do find it helpful in terms of mixing up what content I'm posting, because I will try to focus on a majority of either research or policy, what's happening right now, but then I will share a glimpse of my personal life, just enough to give the viewers or followers a glimpse of who I am. And I find that sometimes reporters will start to catch on. And I think, I forget who mentioned this, but this has really been a theme throughout, which is you need to have a personality. You need to have something to bring to the table, and people need to relate to you in some way for you to be able to make that message and have that message resonate with your audience. So I do enjoy having fun playing around with putting up different types of posts and seeing which gets, the best response, who's going to like what and on what day and what moment. But I'll just add there, because it looks like Rob has his hand raised.
Oh, I mean, I just, for when you were done, but I think another important thing, and maybe we won't have time to go into it much today, is the question of when these things benefit you as an early career person. And they differ a lot. I mean, we could talk about it for a while, but I mean, having a huge Twitter presence I think it's debatable in a very early career. It gives you a community, which can be really useful. But it's different from an interview that you can put on your CV. That's a very concrete contribution that somebody can read and digest immediately. Oh, what was your role in this? And we could talk more about this, but I think it's another thing to think about. What's the goal for you for this work? And I suspect in this group, we all have different goals at different times. But it's really worth being very conscious of it. Why am I doing this for me? Why am I doing this for my audience? Why now? Should I wait 2 years and do more of this in the future?
And that kind of leads into our second to last question, which is, how do you know it's paying off? Like, how do you know that what interactions you're having with the media, what proactive pushes to the public are working? Are they working for you? How do you know?
I would say my biggest thing is, do I get media requests? Am I being asked? It's really, and Robbie, yeah, I mean, I think it's what we've all kind of said in general, which is, again, building rapport. And then do I get a referral almost? And that's what I like to see, the like organic referrals of so-and-so said they did an interview with you and, you know, you helped explain. And I actually do extra additional work. I mean, when I cite, when I'm talking about a study, I don't even make the reporter go find that study. As soon as we get off the phone or as soon as we get off, you know, an interview, I will send them links to the study. I'll send them bullet points. So I try to do the legwork for them. Because again, I think as Rob mentioned, sometimes they've got to write, you know, 2,000 to 5,000 words in one night. So if I can help them that just a little bit of trying to figure out where this study was. So that's biggest, my probably biggest thing is just getting that referral from people saying, hey, I, you know, talked to so-and-so and they gave me your name. But that's a very maybe non-evidence-based way to gauge it. So
I agree with Lindsay. It's a lot about getting that feedback of more reporters and more contacts coming about. In my case, it was also that rewarding feeling of having people from the public contacting me via email or even via Twitter and asking me questions about the report that they read or the interview they heard and those kinds of things. And then asking me more about, I was hoping you wouldn't mind elaborating on these because I have this family member. So that kind of feedback was extremely rewarding and was a total key to me to say, oh, I was able to deliver my message and this is my payback for doing a good job tapping my back.
I think Jennifer's point's a good one too. And it also reminds me that if you do a few interviews, you'll see about the same topic, people ask the same questions again and again. And initially, I hated a lot of those questions because they were often not about what you were doing. But what I came to eventually realize is that was the audience, that was the interviewer saying, like, this is how it matters to me. And if you were hearing that repeatedly, it was really an announcement. Like, look, this is how the whole thing matters to us. Please help us think about that. And so it took me a while to see that. But I think and often those are personal things. Per Jennifer's story, like how do I think about this in my daily life?
Yeah, and just to build upon this, I think for me the biggest indication of reward is that if the story or the piece or whatever it is that I was interviewed for gets the science right. There's a lot of sort of myths around the world of food safety and misconceptions, and if I can, even if it's just on background, which we haven't talked about, that happens a lot where I'll do an interview or I'll get an email exchange with a reporter who I've worked with before, and they're like, hey, I'm writing this, is this right? Or what's missing? And I don't get quoted in it, but the flavor of the story changes, the direction changes, or my portion, if it does get attributed to me, gives a turns out, you know, kind of thing, like here's where we were going, but turns out this is something that we should have thought about. That's the real payoff that I'm adding to the dialogue that wouldn't have necessarily been there unless me or a colleague like me jumped into the fray. And I find that extremely rewarding. And I've seen over my career how we talk about food safety in the media in general is different than it was 15 years ago. And I don't know, like, what's hard to predict is how much of what I've done and what other colleagues who do a lot of media around food safety have been part of that steering or discussion, if at all. But it's changed and it's become more risk-based, and it's become more talking about the science and not about sort of traditional myths, which is very heartening.
So we're coming to the end of our time. Is there any kind of like final thoughts, anything you really want to share with the audience before we wrap it up?
Maybe I would say one thing you can do is to use small interviews to practice, and then use big interviews to really invest your time in and really help to shape a discussion. You know, if you get interviewed by a podcast that has 40 people as audience, it's not a huge impact, but it's a great place to practice, and that can still be picked up. And you might take just a little time on that. But then if you get called by the New York Times, you know, you now have a huge audience, and it's then in that case worth calling a friend, figuring out like, how can I better help this journalist tell this story, because that's then going to be the story. And so per Ben's point, I mean, those moments when you can shape the narrative in some broader way, or, you know, Andy's State of Things interview where you have a big audience, it's really worth spending a lot of time being ready to do whatever it is you want to do in that moment. And I think Jennifer's stories about the vaccines are similar in that way. You're building up how you're going to help society, and you can have small days and big days, I guess.
I like that.
Yeah, I just add to Rob's point that you can, and Andy mentioned this too, you can jump in and jump out when you feel it's the right time to do it. And you don't want to force yourself into a situation that you're uncomfortable, because that's where things can go bad. And maybe not, you know, not drastically bad, but you may not have a great experience. And so there are certainly times in my career where I've been like, hey, I'm just not going to answer questions on this, or I'm going to take a month or two away and say I'm not available to do it. Those questions, they're going to come back. Like you're not going to drop away for forever if you want to get back into it. So thinking about when the right time is to jump in and jump out.
I guess to follow up on that, once you jump in, you probably need to be ready for a roller coaster ride, because when they touch base with you, if it's, for example, a TV local station reaching out to you, they call you at 9 a.m. and they need you to get ready by 11 for the noon, you know, whatever program they have. So it's quite the fast pace. It's not that they email you in the morning and, oh, can you do tomorrow? That happens more with written press, with something that is going to be in a journal. But if it's a TV or a radio might pace a little bit more, but TV definitely, they want to talk to you now because it's coming out at 2 or so quick turnaround. So it's quite a roller coaster ride.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pancorba. Thank you, Dr. Binder. Thank you, Dr. Dunn. Thank you, Dr. Hayes-Maslow. Thank you, Dr. Chapman. This was outstanding. I appreciate all of your time. Thank you, attendees. Our next CALS Comm workshop is happening on November 11th, and it is Anthony Buckner, I would say the state university, NC State University wide Zoom expert, is going to be talking. So that applies for a lot of us. We can never be too good on webinars. So thank you all so much, and hope to see you in November.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Janine.